Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining our team at Farm Journal Foundation tonight for this important event. My name is Tricia Beal. I'm CEO of Farm Journal Foundation, and it's so great to look around the room and see so many friends. It always feels like the World Food Prize is a homecoming weekend or some kind of family reunion, so lots of mission-aligned friends here. Thank you for dedicating your time to be with us. The focus of tonight's event is on the correlation between global food security and national security. This subject is uniquely relevant at this moment as conflict grips several regions of our world, and people are experiencing unimaginable heartbreak and loss as a result. These conflicts have placed increased stress on a world that is already in the midst of a hunger and malnutrition crisis. The World Food Program has proclaimed that 2023 is a year of extreme jeopardy with the 345 million people who are facing acute food insecurity. Rising hunger and malnutrition have been accelerated by a polycrisis, unlike anything we've experienced during our time. And this is all coming together based on the convergence of the global pandemic, climate change, and conflict. And it's driving immense amounts of human suffering. Earlier this year, Farm Journal Foundation partnered with Dr. Edwin Price and his team at Texas A&M University to produce a paper exploring how improvements in global food security can help alleviate national security risks in the United States and beyond. We're so grateful that Dr. Price is here with us this evening to lead our esteemed panel. And if you're interested in copies of this paper, they're available at the back of the room. We have two important leaders who are joining us for opening comments tonight. Dr. Manjeet Misra, the director of USDA's National Institute for Food and Agriculture, NIFA, and Senator Joni Ernst, who was elected as the first woman to serve in a federal office from the state of Iowa in 2014, and also became the first female combat veteran to be elected to serve in the United States Senate. Senator Ernst has been a longtime supporter of agriculture and a champion on global hunger and national security issues. Senator Ernst will join us via video. So let's get started. It is an honor to introduce Dr. Manjeet Misra, who is a global treasure in agriculture, technology, and food security. He's also a great friend to our foundation and a mentor that we admire and value very much. Dr. Manjeet Misra is the director of NIFA, USDA's extramural funding agency in the Research, Education, and Economics mission area. Dr. Misra is a world-renowned scientist who has had transformational impact on food security through the application of engineering principles to seeds, the most vital and fundamental element of food security. Prior to joining NIFA, he was the director of the Seed Science Center at Iowa State University, a position he held from 1991 until 2023. He was also the endowed chair of Seed Science, Technology, and Systems. His interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to leadership has been effective at the state, national, and international levels. He's been a member of the American Society of Agriculture and Biological Engineers for 37 years. He is past chair of the National Genetics Resource Advisory Council with USDA. And this is the best part. Dr. Misra is the co-author or author on 137 publications and co-inventor on 10 patents. That's a lot of innovation. Throughout his career, Dr. Misra has received numerous awards, including the 2018 Suckup Global Food Security Award, the Distinguished Service Award for Leadership, Vision, Exemplary Service to the U.S. seed industry from the American Seed Trade Association, the Outstanding Achievement Award in International Agriculture from Iowa State University, and the Global Academic Leadership Award from the Indian Council of Food and Agriculture. Dr. Misra was sworn in to his 6-year appointment as director of NIFA on May 8, 2023. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Misra to the stage.
Can you hear me in the back? Wow, I got power. How about now? Is it clear? Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is an honor to be invited to speak on this timely, relevant topic, and also to be in the same session where Senator Joni Ernst is going to make a presentation. In fact, this particular topic is very dear to her heart. We had some discussion on this, and to mine. So as you can tell, thank you, Tricia, for that introduction. If you remember, Tricia, David Lambert introduced us a number of years back. And I feel David Lambert's presence in here, in the room. He was a champion of child nutrition, 1,000 days, and made a huge contribution to global food security. So this one is for you, David. As you can tell, I have been a professor at Iowa State University for many years, so I can speak for 55 minutes on any subject at any time. We got to have some fun, folks. As you can also tell, what I want to do is give you a little bit of background on me, because I think sometimes we just don't tell each other who we are and ask them who they are. That's where all the conversations begin, isn't it? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, and then tell a little bit about what NIFA does, how the global food security and national security are intertwined, and what NIFA is doing in this area. So as you can tell, Manjit Mishra is an all-American name. I originally came from India and then went to University of Missouri. But before I went to University of Missouri, the college I went to was designed on land-grant mission. And this is very important that we really realize that this land-grant mission is just such a wonderful concept. Research discovers knowledge, extension transfers that knowledge into useful practices, and education brings the new leaders, the new generation of future leaders. This integration is something that has really made a huge difference in the world. And I am very much a land-grant guy. I love land-grant mission. So I was educated with the land-grant philosophy in my undergraduate education. Then I came to University of Missouri, and there I got 2 degrees and 1 wife. Through 4-H. Through 4-H. She was a state delegate to the 4-H annual festival. I was an international token student. I wanted to know, what is this 4-H, head, hand, and heart, and health? I was curious. And then we met. We became best friends. After 38 years of marriage, we are still best friends. Then I went to Iowa State. And of course, there I worked on seeds. But for the last 5 months, I have been serving as the director of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, which is the external funding agency of USDA. What NIFA does is to fund about 100 or little more than 100 land-grant institutions and enables them to serve their constituents. We have about $2 billion budget annually that we invest. And I'm telling you this thing for a region, and I'll come to that a little bit later, how we are going to do some strategic change and planning in our priorities. And global food security is going to be front and center, which is intertwined with the national security. So food, my staff wrote a wonderful draft, which I may not use because I like to speak from my heart. I will use it as guidelines. But so here it is. Food is the foundation of society and of civilization. But as Trisha mentioned, at the present time, the world is a very hot, hungry, and thirsty place. The world is also interconnected. And in this interconnected world, the stability and the security of our nation are intimately tied to the food security of the globe. It's not just a matter of providing enough food. It's about safeguarding our nation's stability, prosperity, and well-being. President Biden has laid out a national security strategy, which is an inclusive and sustainable agriculture-led economic growth. It requires working across entire food system, consider every step from cultivation to consumption, and to integrate these efforts within larger context of climate, health, conflict mitigation, and peace building. This gives us the big picture. In order to ensure sustainable implementation of this big picture, we need to partner both with the domestic and international partners. Food security brings personal security and peace. When people are well fed and well nourished, not just fed, nourished, sometimes we forget that food is not just for energy, but for nutrition, for health. So when people are well fed and well nourished, they feel secure, productive, and peaceful. This peace, individual peace, extends to the family, and then to the community, to the state, to the region, and to the world. So food is about peace. This is precisely why we are recognizing the roots of peace. Heidi Kuhn, the World Food Prize laureate, she is all about peace. As Dr. Norman Borlaug often said, world peace cannot and will not be built on empty stomachs and human misery. Food is also about health security. When you eat good food, you don't need a lot of medicine. When you don't, you need a lot of it. Let me tell you, I like to tell stories. I received a few grants from Gates Foundation, and you know why Gates Foundation started funding agricultural projects? This is why. When Melinda Gates at one time was visiting Africa, she asked a woman, "Are you taking your medicine?" As you know, Gates Foundation used to fund human health, HIV, malaria, and so on. And she asked the woman, "Are you taking your medicine?" And she said, no, ma'am, I have stopped taking medicine. She said, why? And she said that this medicine says to take it with food, and I have no food. I have no food. So Melinda Gates came back and said that we need to fund agriculture, food. And that's how they have put investments of billions of dollars into agricultural project. So food is also about health security. Now, when food is affordable and accessible, it ensures that households have the stability needed to engage in economic activity. So food is about economic security. The families then work together to make their communities strong and vibrant. I have noticed in US, a lot of people volunteer. They like to make their community vibrant and strong, and they are joyful. Agriculture is the biggest employer in many of these countries. When young people have jobs, they have confidence in themselves. They feel their worth. Food shortage, on the other hand, historically, has led to civil unrest and even political turmoil with riots. This has a broader ripple effect to regional stability. We have seen how this can strain resources and disrupt not only the affected nations, but also our own, as the US deals with the consequence of these larger scale migrations. Access to food is tied to the relationship with many countries. Ensuring global food security helps reduce the potential for these resource-related conflicts. At the core of these relationships are our own producers who also benefit from enhanced export. Now, interestingly, when we enhance our export, we also import. It is a conclusive fact that countries that export more, import more. So there is a tremendous, vibrant trade, foreign trade. You know, agriculture is a very site-specific subject. It's a seed that grows in one soil will not grow in another. So we have to grow where the crops are grown best, and then move them so that everybody has access to food. So one thing that we are doing in NIFA is to make sure that the policies and regulations are such so that they are science-based, not based on politics. Another reason why food security is intertwined with national security is because we need to be prepared for pathogen X. Pest X, why? Unknown. If the human pandemic has taught us anything, COVID, that the viruses, bacteria, and fungi will not stay where they originate. They don't need visa or passport to travel. They travel in wind, with water, on people. In fact, it is just a matter of when they will appear in our source, even if they are right now maybe in Latin America or Africa. Just think of wheat rust. Think of the animal diseases, exotic animal diseases, avian influenza, so on. So we cannot be complacent that it has started somewhere. We need to be vigilant. And we need to be prepared. Remember soybean rust? Because US was prepared, soybean rust was valued at $12 billion of economic loss for US soybean industry. But because US was prepared, we didn't have a very big havoc. But anywhere a pest or pathogen raises its ugly head, it's only a matter of time when it arrives in our soil. So we are very much now knowledgeable about human pandemic. What about a plant pandemic, an animal pandemic? To really be positioned, we need to have collaboration with other countries and with the private sector, For example, Corteva has branches in over 60 countries. Their scientists are constantly monitoring what is developing in many of these countries. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to be collaborating with the private sector and the public sector of other countries. That is a must. Now, this also needs, which I know Senator Ernst will probably mention, is ag cybersecurity. Ag cybersecurity is a big deal. It's not fiction anymore. It has actually happened in some of the seed and food industries. A co-op in Iowa could not plant the seeds because the data was hacked at the grain co-op level. See, the data is not held by the farmers. It's variable rate planting. We are planting by the foot. And that data is held at the co-op, and that data was hacked. So the farmers couldn't plant the seed. If you don't plant, you don't harvest, do you? So I think ag cybersecurity is something that I think Senator Joni Ernst is very much championing, that we need to have a plan, and she is very much starting something in the federal level to make sure that that happens. So what are we doing in NIFA in this area? NIFA, as I mentioned, has a $2 billion budget. We are focusing on 4 C's. C for capacity building, 1C. Capacity building at various land-grant institutions. This is long-term security funding so that they will have infrastructure, so that if something happens, then they are ready to act. I just gave the keynote at the Golden Goose Award. Golden Goose Award is something that people have received because they thought of something nobody did. There was 3 people out of 5 who were funded by NIFA that received the Golden Goose Award. One of them was Paul Seigel. Paul Seigel worked for 57 years on poultry research. And NIFA funded that research, very small amount of money. But that gave him the base. Mary Dell Chilton, remember her? She is the one who developed the plant transformation technology for biotechnology. NIFA funded her in the very beginning of her career. So we build capacity. That's first C. Then the second thing we do is we collaborate in innovation. We just funded $100 million to set up 5 artificial intelligence institutes in collaboration with NSF. So that is collaboration. And we collaborate with national associations, National Extension County Association, APLU, with you, Farm Journal Foundation, with the World Food Prize. Collaboration is the second C. The third C is cultivation. It's not just cultivating the ground, but cultivating the next generation of leaders. We just invested $262 million to cultivate what we call the next gen. Our vision is to have 20,000 agricultural professionals trained in food and agriculture. And there, we have two strong criteria for this funding: diversity and equity. Diversity and equity. Now, what is diversity? Of course, it is absolutely essential. Diversity in nature, if you look at, is beauty. That's what produces beauty. The fall is coming. Pretty soon the leaves will fall from the leaves. They will turn yellow, then velvet red, then crimson red. There will be a festival of colors. Why? It's the diversity of colors that produces beauty. But in workplace, diversity creates creativity. If everyone looked like me, good looking, talked like me, and thought like me, why do I need to converse with others? I might as well look at the mirror. So diversity is absolutely essential for creativity. So we are going to make diversity and equity. What is equity? And this also goes to our global security and national security are interrelated. What is equity? Equity is not equality. Equity is not equality. Equity is you help those who need your help the way they need your help. That is equity. You bring everybody up, lift everybody up. People who have not had a seat at the table. The minority. That is equity. So we are going to have these two, diversity and equity. That's the third C. The fourth C, which is very dear to my heart, is communication. We have not communicated the value and beauty of agriculture to the policymakers, to the public, and in general. Scientists often think that if they have published, if they have got patents, then they are good. But that is not enough. We need to communicate. As scientists, we think of communicating with data. Of course, data is important. But data does not capture a person at their heart. It captures their mind. And mind, as you know, is a marketplace with thoughts crisscrossing each other. If you want to convince somebody, you have to touch them at their heart level. So think of a little kid walking to the school, jumping, skipping, because she had a good breakfast, nutritious breakfast. A video, 3 to 5 minute video of that. That's what NIFA is going to do through the land grant institutions. We want their success stories to be our success stories. We are going to be on NPR. We are going to be on PBS. We haven't told our story. And it is so exciting. What more nobler profession there is than to feed and nourish, particularly women and children. So that's going to be the fourth C. 4 C's. So it is, we are going to, as you know, NIFA is a domestic organization, funds domestic programs. But we have deliberately, proactively, consciously had chosen to develop a global program in NIFA. we have a Center for International Program, which is okay. But to me, international is not global. International means it's out there, somewhere out there. It does not affect us. But global is what we are going to do is to rename it as Center for Global Engagement and work with APLU, work with the various national organizations, with IICA. We have already visited with IICA, with global organizations, with the World Bank, with the USAID, and multilateral donor agencies, to make sure that the technology, for example, the artificial intelligence technology, we need to have responsible application of this technology. How do we do that? A technology can be both good or bad. And it's only through collaboration, through partnerships, through risk and benefit analysis, we can move the technology forward. So I think hopefully this will be our mode of operation. I traveled to Africa quite a bit, and there was a proverb that I often heard, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So we are going to go far because we will work together, we will grow together, and we will make a difference together in feeding and nourishing US and the world. Thank you very much.
Hi, folks. This is Joni Ernst, the junior senator from the great state of Iowa. While I'm sorry I can't be with you all in person, I'm honored to share a few words with you. First, I'd like to thank the team at the World Food Prize Foundation for organizing this year's Borlaug Dialogue. I'm proud to be from a state that feeds and fuels the world, and honored that this world-renowned symposium responsible for bringing together international leaders in global food security is held right here in Des Moines. I'd also like to commend the Farm Journal Foundation for hosting this important discussion on how global food security is tied to national security. As a proud Iowa farm girl who later went on to serve our country as a commander in the U.S. Army Reserve and the Iowa Army National Guard, the connection between food security and national security is one I understand well. While representing Iowans in the Senate on both the Armed Services and Agricultural Committees, I've been able to put my experience on these issues to work, spearheading policy that improves our food supply and country's security. Thank you for taking the time to attend today's event and dive deeper into this critical topic. I hope you have a lively and productive discussion that leaves you better able to harness change in the name of global food security and nutrition. Enjoy the rest of the symposium, and may God bless you all.
Thanks to Senator Ernst for sending in her video. I'm Kelsey Barnes, the Director of Government Affairs for Farm Journal Foundation, and I have been tasked with introducing our moderator, who will then give a little background on his paper and introduce the rest of the panel. Dr. Price, it's an honor to introduce my former professor and a current mentor. Dr. Price has many accomplishments over his career, some of them notably in different areas that he's worked. He's been on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, South Sudan, the DR Congo, and many other impacted and affected fragile states. He is also the endowed chair via the Howard G. Buffett Foundation on Conflict and Development at Texas A&M, as well as being a professor in the Department of Ag Economics at Texas A&M. Dr. Price has literally written legislation that has been passed for government agencies to better partner with land-grant universities in the effort to improve international ag development. He has worked in numerous countries. He has written numerous papers, and we're honored to have him write the paper that you saw in the back and the topic of this discussion. Most notably for me, and most importantly for me, Dr. Price has always been willing to take the time to visit with students and his peers to share his experience, his knowledge, and his unforgettable stories. So with that, I would like to turn it over and say, Dr. Price, I appreciate all the text, phone calls, and emails that you have answered via me. But also, as a foundation, we appreciate you writing this paper, and we really look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Kelsey. I see lots of familiar faces from over the years that we worked together. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. As Kelsey mentioned, our discussion tonight is partly based on a paper that we prepared for the Farm Journal Foundation. Thanks so much to the Farm Journal Foundation for your support. That was given at the U.S. Congress in March. And it was given to the U.S. Congress in March. Tonight we're going to deal with some of those issues. We want to look at how food insecurity impacts national security. Originally, we looked at national security of the U.S., but it's really not confined to the U.S. Every nation's security is based upon the food security in their own country, as well as the food security in adjoining countries. We talked about really 5 vectors by which food security impacts national security. Political, socio-political vectors that involve, we've already talked about them, migration that's sometimes disruptive, overall positive, but can be disruptive both for those who are migrating as well as the communities that receive migrants. Terrorism and drug and gang warfare in communities. There are economic vectors. Our access to natural resources, any country's access to natural resources is important to its own economic advancement. There's our environmental impacts. We're all aware of those impacts, that how food insecurity and the desperation to produce one's own food sometimes leads to deforestation, degradation of soils, air, water, and so on. And reduction of biodiversity. There are, I think, 3,000 drugs that are used in the world today that are based on tropical forests. 70% of the plant-based drugs used in cancer are from tropical forests. It's estimated only 15% of the biological diversity of forests has been exploited at this point. Those forests are an enormous storehouse for the future health of many nations. And finally, there's the cultural impact that desperation can erode national values. In our discussions previous this year, we identified 4 or 5 major solutions or directions to take in combating these problems. One of them is international agricultural research. Since in the last decade ending in 2022, investment in international agricultural research has been around $1 billion, sometimes a little bit less, a little bit more. During that same period of time, food assistance has increased from $2.5 billion to $14 billion. So one asks the question, why aren't we thinking about the long term? Food assistance, it's needed today. No one is against food assistance. It's desperately needed. But we really need to be thinking about the long term and how to solve hunger over the longer period. We talked about Central America. It's a common issue to discuss, especially from Texas, what's happening on our border and the migration for Central America. The increase in productivity in productivity of cereal grains in Central America have has essentially not changed in 50 years. It's increased absolutely, but per capita production has not increased. Do we need a program specifically for South America with a major campaign to increase food production in Central America? Young agriculturalists, we really need to engage our developed country young agriculturalists in international agricultural research with partners in developing countries. I see Cedric Habarime from Rwanda here today, a young professional from Rwanda. We really appreciate what you're doing and what you're contributing. But we really need to engage our young professionals in international agricultural research, being partners to young scientists in other countries. And of course, the Borlaug Young Scientist program is extremely important in that area. But not only do we need one-on-one relationships, we need institutional relationships. We used to have very, very strong relationships between U.S., particularly academic institutions and institutions in developing countries. In 1985, a BIFAD report showed that there were 15,000 foreign students supported by USAID in this country. Today, we can't get a number, but we think it's well less than 1,000, probably something on the order of 200 or 300. Just imagine what difference that's making in our productivity. When we speak of the decline in agricultural productivity, a recent report from Virginia Tech University called the GAP Report projects that we need to have about a 1.75% increase per year in total factor productivity in order to feed the world in 2050. Last year, that number was around 1.4. But guess who were the laggards in this? Don't be surprised. Sub-Saharan Africa had a low rate of positive increase in total factor productivity. The United States of America ranked negative increase in total factor productivity in agriculture in the U.S. over the last 10 years because of lack of investment in agricultural research. So we've got a big hill to climb in the future to provide for food security. I want to now introduce our panelists one by one, and if you'd like to make comments along the lines of what we've said already, or your own perspectives on this, I'd like to turn first to Kip Tom. Kip Tom is former ambassador to FAO, best known as a farmer. And Kip, I'd like to know your perspectives on the kinds of issues that we're facing.
Well, certainly. Thank you, Dr. Price. Appreciate that introduction and to be a part of this dialogue tonight. You know, I want to start out. I think you need to know where people come from to know where they're going and what they plan on doing in life. And one thing that we've all said in this room, we cannot choose who we're born to or where we're born. And that really became evident to me as I traveled around the world serving as a U.S. ambassador to the UN Rome-based agencies. But I look back in my own history and our family, and we came to the United States from Switzerland in the late 1600s. We fought in the Revolutionary War, both sides of the Civil War. We lived through all the other wars. We lived through the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. We experienced the Industrial Revolution. We've seen hybrid technologies come to the farmer. We've seen the Green Revolution. Then suddenly we saw analytics and machine learning coming to the farm, and genetic changes that really made our farms more productive. And as I served in this role, I soon said to myself, when I go to these developing countries, why hasn't it happened here yet? And I go back to this story, and my father left us about 1.5 years ago, and 3 days before he passed, he said goodbye to 55 of my family members. And at the end of that day, he said, I want to go for one ride back down to the farm. We went down to the farm, we sat on a rock. It was February, mind you. And we talked about family. We talked about farming. But before we left, one thing that Dad will always talk about is yields and crops. And Dad said, you know, this farm we're looking at that you and I first farmed on when you were a child yielded 30 bushel when I was a child. This year I know you took off 240 bushel corn. My generation, he meant his generation, did that. He said, what is your generation going to do? And I took that as a challenge from my father, who passed 3 days later. And so serving in the role as the ambassador, as I traveled around and I experienced these places, I went to places where people were migrating out of Syria. I saw them in Yemen, Somalia, across Ethiopia, Sudan, and many other places. And there's no more empty feeling in seeing the despair that's in these people's faces. Oftentimes a single mother with her children, because the man was still back fighting. We can talk about all the impacts of when people are food insecure and the impacts on our own national security because people get caught up in human trafficking. 1 of 30 million people a year, they get caught up in illicit drugs and arm movement. But worst case scenario, they get involved in terrorist activities. We know that. I know we're going to talk about that tonight, but there's another one. There's another one because the United States was food insecure at one point in time in its early days, back during the Depression when people were spending 40% of disposable income on food, weren't able to feed their families, didn't have access, and we were living in severe poverty. You know, so when I look at our food supply chain today and I look how it's been, the impact of supply chains, the impact of the Ukrainian war, what we saw from COVID, we're vulnerable today, very vulnerable. So I want to take more of a focus. I know the others are going to focus on the developing world. I'm going to focus on the developed world because when I look at our fertilizer supply chains as an example, do we need to be buying fertilizer from Russia or Belarus or China? Do we need to be buying our critical components, the building blocks that allow us to be a food secure nation that's economically secure, that is a major breadbasket for the world and a world leader, and our ability to contribute on the humanitarian side? And when I look at that, I look at last year's budget was $14.2 billion. That budget this year is close to $5 billion. So think about in a family of 6, what 4 members aren't going to eat this year? So this is where, when we look at development, we need to do a better job of development around the world. At the same time, we need to make sure our own food system is functioning well to make sure that we can be a major supplier. I look forward to some of the questions and comments.
Great. We'll come back around to questions in a moment. I want to ask Tucker, perhaps, if he'll introduce himself next. Tucker is the Executive Director of Roots of Peace. He has some claim of relationship to this year's ceremonies. But congratulations to your family. So, Tucker, what is your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Price. Oh, good? All right. Now we're on. Yeah, so Roots of Peace works with smallholder farmers and workers across the supply chain around the world, specifically in war-torn countries. You know, my wife and I, Cassandra, we actually moved to Guatemala to be closer to one of our project sites. And we also work in Afghanistan, where the majority of our activities are. And, you know, helping smallholder farmers is really where our passion lies. And, you know, we've done a lot of great work, and we've been able to get close to these communities. And as a primer for this discussion, I invite, you know, each of you to imagine if you were to live in a community where there's no work available, where everyone's savings are depleted, and where your family has run out of money, and you don't know where your next meal will come from. And, you know, what would you do in that situation? You know, I know with my wife and my 2 kids, I would do just about anything. You know, I'd fight for them. I'd make some hard decisions, and I'd have to go through with it. And this is what I've seen in Afghanistan and Vietnam and in Guatemala. And I'll share one story with you. This woman named Fatima in eastern Afghanistan. After COVID and then the regime change in Afghanistan, her family was struggling to the max. She had no choices. Her husband wanted her to sell her 11-year-old daughter into marriage. And it wasn't a good marriage. And she had to think, what can I possibly do to save them? She's too young. She's just a child. She's not ready for this. She didn't have any options. She was ready to give in and make that decision that she would never have considered at any point in her life until this absolutely desperate situation. And so, fortunately for her, you know, this is how I met her, was we had a grant, and we made a raise and drying facility, and she was able to make minimum wage in Afghanistan, which was just enough for her family to be able to feed themselves. But she had to make that choice, and she had made it in her mind. She was ready to sell one of her children so that other kids eat. So when we're talking here about food security, it's not just about hunger. It's about life and death. It's about what's going to happen to that family when they make these real tough decisions. What's going to happen to their communities? What's going to happen to our international security? There's all these implications, and these are people we're talking about. So I really want to make sure we focus on that. And during this conversation, I invite each of you to think about what your decision would be if you were put into that situation. So, Dr. Price, thanks for including me on this panel, and yeah, I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Tucker. Thanks very much. Bram Gefferts is the Director General of CIMMYT. He was the 2014 winner or awardee of the Field Research and Application Award from the Rockefeller Foundation. Bram, what are your perspectives on our discussion today? Yeah.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the Farm Journal Foundation, of course. Also fantastic words from the NIFA director. And I have to say, Ed, I've been looking to say something additional here in the panel, and I've been struggling a bit because this document is really, it's really a strong document. And if you haven't read it, at least read the 2 first pages, which is the executive summary. Because there are really smart pointers there, and I think one element that we are all convinced about, and especially about after this very strong story, there is no peace without food, but it's also very difficult to produce food if there is no peace. And I think with the Russian-Ukraine conflict, we have been very clear how if in one area in the globe the food production is disrupted, how the ripple effects of those are very far-reaching. And I think this shows that we are talking about a stacked system, a global system, a regional system, but also a farming system, and with that actually a plant system, that if we drive it to efficiency, have we actually foreseen enough redundancy to also make it resilient, so that when you take out one area, that there is still backup capacity. And what does that mean for us as researchers, I think is something we need to look at. And it's some of those consequences that probably need to put in the next document with an executive summary. Very likely what happened or I hope, what happened with the Ukraine-Russia crisis, the probability that something similar happens, but due to climate change, an area going down because of a climate change shock is probably more probable in the future, and I foresee those shocks to come faster and quicker. Or for example, a COVID, somebody mentioned it with COVID, a COVID for UG99. 99, Borlaug's big breakthrough was because he made wheat, yes, more productive, but and of course shorter. But the basis was basically resistance to rust, right? So in 99 in Uganda, a new rust species came up, and it could have wiped out the complete production of wheat were it not because we had backup in Mexico with a lot of biodiversity, 150,000 different accessions that were used to produce or to quickly respond and actually generate, again, UG99 resistant varieties. We did not do that alone. We did that thanks to collaborations with Texas A&M and Kansas and many other universities here. And actually, that's one of the beauties of this. It was something that happened in Uganda, but it could have affected wheat in the US. And it is the interesting thing of the investments that the US government makes in the organization I have the honor to represent. Yes, it has a big impact on the rest of the world, but also today 60% of the wheat grown in the US comes from those research efforts. And I'm not saying only the organization, but the organization and the many we have the honor collaborating with, and we couldn't do without you. So in that sense, it makes sense. It makes sense economically. It also makes sense for a future view. Having that said, I do think we need to challenge ourselves as research community. I think we're still too much looking at a problem yesterday, the whole COVID vaccine. If you look at it from a science element, there was a crisis. We responded. We could respond quickly. We had a solution. But it was still a problem that happened yesterday to which we run very fast to resolve it tomorrow. And kudos to everybody who was involved in that. But if we keep doing that, we're going to exhaust ourselves. I think we need to find ways with our predictive capability, with the data capability, with the systems understanding, that we really can look at problems from tomorrow and resolve them today. Can we use some of the knowledge we have about biodiversity to actually build in, how long does it, seed experts, new seed takes 5 years? How long does it take to get it to the farmer? 7 years? If climate change goes fast, we should actually be thinking those 7 years down the road when that seed is there, what needs to be sitting in that seed, to simplify it a little bit. And are there no regret investments? Are there traits that we can put in there, not for the climate of today or the circumstance of today, but actually for that circumstance 7? And then how long is a farmer going to use it? Probably another 7 years. So that, I mean, especially in Africa, maybe I'm being generous, so that means 14 years down the road. So how can we look at some of that redundancy and some of that resilience at different levels? Resilience in our food supply, resilience in our systems, resilience in our farming communities, resilience in the farm system per se, resilience in the plant. How vulnerable is the plant? How difficult is it to take down a critical pathway in a plant? And how difficult would that be for a bad actor to do that deliberately? And are we going to screen for all those elements? Probably we're going to go crazy. Or do we build, I mean, it's probably not going to work anyway because there's too many of those. Or do we need to build another element of resilience into those crops and into the system to tie it back completely to national security?
I might follow up with that, Bram. When you mentioned that it will take 15 years for a new technology to really hit the ground running, then who do you need to be talking to about that technology? Is it the 50-year-old farmer, or is it the youth?
I think definitely it is the youth, but I also think also think we need to be more sophisticated about how do we predict our future worlds, right? So I think it is really about, okay, we have been a bit pessimistic here. I also want to be a bit optimistic. I think we have never had the same capability or capacity to analyze and create what things can look like, to test things in a data-driven decision space. I sometimes make very dumb decisions, but we have the capability now to have smarter computers than I am, luckily, that can actually create some of those decision-making spaces. Now, still, there's going to be me's that take dumb decisions, but if we can put a bit of knowledge around that and then help us to make better decisions through data capabilities, decision-making capabilities, I think that will help a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I just was thinking about working in Iraq and meeting, working mostly with 50, 60-year-old farmers. And I was thinking to myself, what sense does this really make when we know that it's going to take technology 7, 8, 10 years to really begin to make an impact? It'll take a few years to make an impact, and yet you're talking to farmers who probably won't be around when that technology is really taking hold. So I'm just saying we need to be working with the youth as well, young farmers. Tucker, I'm going to pick on you. Two things. We're talking sort of at a macro level about the relationship between food insecurity at a nation level and a nation's insecurity. You've had the opportunity to see it at the community level. When you see food insecurity in a household or 2 or 3 households or some percentage of households in a community, what is the impact on the community as a whole? Can you see at the village level these relationships that we're talking about, that food insecurity in households in a community impact the safety and the security of the entire community? I'm just hypothesizing you may have seen that. And also tell us an optimistic story, too.
Okay. So first, a little pessimistic. In in Afghanistan, again, they're just going through such a difficult time right now. And again, when the community has nothing, then there's nothing to share. Then there's desperation. People are forced, again, to think about their nuclear unit. And what are they going to do? You know, are they going to steal? Maybe. You know, are they going to take arms if that's an opportunity to make some money or get at the people who they're thinking, you know, are causing these problems? Yes. These are realities that, you know, we don't like to think about. Or maybe sometimes when we're in our positions of privilege, we think we might be above this. You know, these people who are making these decisions, they're good people just like us, or, you know, diverse people. And so it fractures communities, and it causes them to take a different path than they wouldn't otherwise go. In Guatemala, the situation isn't quite as secure, or quite as insecure right now, and seeing what happens out in those communities is amazing because they really care about each other. Whenever you go out there, and the level of compassion and willingness to share is astounding. When they have absolutely nothing except the very bare minimum, they're going to split that in half and share it with you. And they're trying. They're trying as an individual, as a family, as a community. They work together. They take what they have. And sometimes it's enough, and sometimes it's not. So again, when we could come in and give those communities varying levels of support, they have a lot of their solutions already, or, you know, through engagements with, you know, universities and whatnot, where we could share knowledge, which is important too. We could help get them up to that level where they could start to make the decisions they want to be making, not the decisions they have to make. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Kip, I'm going to toss a couple of big ones to you. Okay. Right now, the world's in a pretty desperate situation in terms of trade. Countries are scrambling to find out where's their sources of energy, where they're going to get their grains, where they're going to get their food. And it seems somewhat apparent that relationships are changing very quickly. Alliances in trade are changing. Do you think what do you see in that respect? And do you think they're going to stick, those new changes? I'm going to ask you a totally different question to go right behind that. And this has to do with institutional cooperation. In 2005, I was working in Iraq and met the Minister of Agriculture, Sausan Ali Shafri. She actually got her bachelor's degree in animal science at Iowa State, Minister of Agriculture of Iraq. And I said, actually several of us were there, we said, what is your biggest problem? You know, what is your biggest challenge in agriculture for Iraq in 2005? She said, my biggest problem is coordinating and mediating among the international agencies here to help me. Said, I am mediating hostilities. I am trying to, you know, make friends out of people who are competing with each other, and that is my biggest problem. I don't think that was only in Iraq. I think interagency cooperation in developing countries, in developed countries, and international agencies may be a problem. I just want to hear if you have a perspective on that as well.
Well, Dr. Price, to start out with your first question, I'd say that one thing that we learned in preparing ourselves for the role that I served in is a nation's power or national security is predicated upon 4 key elements. One is economic strength, another is diplomatic, another is informational, and another is military. But I will add there's another element that's important, and that's food. If you don't have food, you're not going to have any of the above. And I think that we're living in the United States right now, and I know a lot of other countries are looking at this. Obviously, the developing countries are. we've got to get this so people really understand it, that we have to put a real focus on food security, even in the United States of America and other developed countries around the world. And I can say that, you know, when I look at that and I look at what's going on in the European Union right now, this is one of the biggest challenges we faced in working with the FAO was, you know, you have 194 ambassadors working there. It's very bureaucratic, a lot of strength for the European Union with 27 votes. They wanted to move towards a food system that wasn't really going to give them the resilience or capacity building that they needed in Europe. I think they're on the state of being actually a net food importer at some point in time. But therein lies the opportunities for the United States and continents like Africa. I look at Central America. This is where trade comes in. This is where we need to start working more closely with African nations, trying to find a means of products that we need in the United States and products that they need as well. But when I look at trade, I look at what took place about 3 months ago in the BRICS meeting that took place in South Africa. I think it's clear that there are new alliances shaping up around the world. And I think Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, when they walked out of the Kremlin back in, I think it was January, and the comment was captured of whoever thought the world would change so fast it would be in such control today. We need to take that as a warning. We need to make sure that those of us that have the humanitarian beliefs, that have the beliefs in doing what we can in development to play a role to make sure their vision doesn't come true. We need to make sure that we see a vision of seeing a world in peace, and those 4 elements plus food is a part of every nation's trade.
Great. Thanks a lot. I'd love to ask more questions of the panel, and maybe if any of you want to respond to anything that's on your mind right now, please do so. But at the same time, I'm going to see if there are persons in the audience who'd like to ask questions. Okay, we've got one right in the very back. Well, first, anybody want to say anything? You got okay, great.
Oh, why, thank you. Hi, I'm Joanna Veltri, and I work with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Thank you so much for this very important panel. We are big believers in the food security as national security. What I wanted to touch on brings us back to Dr. Misra's 4th C, which is communication. And I really appreciate the discussion of the importance that he brought to the international component and calling it global, in that it really does, you know, the effects go across borders, the effects go both ways, as Ambassador Tom has mentioned, the trade component, et cetera. Much like technological innovation, it's only as good as its accessibility to the target audience, right? And the same thing is true for communication. I think this is a place where we need to focus more, and I do have a question here, I promise. Many of us work with communicating the urgency of addressing adaptation and resilience building in developing countries around the world for vulnerable rural smallholder farmers. And, you know, we do this for many reasons, ethical, moral, the compelling reasons that you've laid out so eloquently. But ultimately, there are also national security implications for us at home. And I think the funding gap that you highlighted, Professor, at the beginning is daunting to us in terms of nobody's arguing that there should be $1 less of humanitarian funding, right? Those are urgent needs. But the degree to which we have funding for these development initiatives, the interventions that are necessary to build adaptation and resilience for our smallholder farmers and for our food systems in countries around the world, is a drop in the bucket compared to the humanitarian funding. Tiny, tiny, tiny. I'll take the example so that I'm not institutionally self-serving, because I could talk about how EFAD could use a lot more money and could scale up, but I'll just point to the example that was raised today in the plenary about Feed the Future, USAID's fantastic program, super effective. They've moved from 12 to 20 countries. Their budget is the same as it was, what, 10 years ago? And so, what my question is ultimately is, we've got, in the US case, although this is true around the world, this is not just a US problem, we've got Congress, we've got the public, we've got policymakers, legislators, others. How do we best move the needle on the communication front? Getting people to understand that this problem is so big and that funding for those sort of interventions that impact our future and our ability to not have even higher humanitarian needs. How do we move that needle? Thank you.
Kip, I saw you.
I'm ready.
Okay, great. Okay, go right ahead.
Yeah, obviously we need to communicate much more. I dealt with EFAD in Rome and obviously all the other UN agencies. At the end of the day, we were counting on them to do everything. We can't. We need our extensions, we need all our other agencies, but you know what? Who has the intellectual property? Who has the capital? Who has the ability to go out here and educate people? The private sector. We need private sector engagement across the developing world to bring the tools and technology and let them reinvest in those communities. Not do it philanthropically, do it in a manner where people are actually taking ownership of it. Now, I don't know if I'm addressing your communication, but I think we get out here, we really need to focus on those companies, or private sector, getting involved, partnering with our UN agencies and others like ROMS to make sure that we can create that resiliency and capacity building in agriculture, because without them, it's not going to occur. We've tried it for a long time, and let's face it, we're not making the inroads that we need to in solving this global problem.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you. When you were making your point, you said that in the past 10 years, could you please, which is your idea, how this country can solve the problem and how that is affecting right now, not just the economy, but also the security in the country?
Yes, the point was that this is a point in a report from Virginia Tech University. It's routinely made, looking at world total factor productivity and then factor productivity by region. And the U.S. is a laggard compared to the rest of the world in its increase in agricultural productivity. And your question is, what can be done about that? Well, basically, it really pretty much points to stagnation in our investment in agricultural technology. We need to be investing more in agricultural research and extension and the programs that will bring that along. Are there other comments that anyone else would like to make about that? It's really astounding. I was quite surprised. I think many people have been shocked to discover that the U.S. has fallen back over the last decade in agricultural productivity. Latin America, for example, as a whole, is much better off, has had much better return on its investment. Yes, Peter.
Ed, you commented on the number of years that it has traditionally taken from research to actual farm use of product. I'm wondering if the artificial intelligence could dramatically shift that. And if that's the case, what are the implications in terms of potential concentration of work given the database and so forth required?
That's an interesting proposition. I can't help but think that artificial intelligence is going to help somewhat. I've done a lot of use so far myself using ChatGPT, and I'm batting about 50% on having valid results and information that's correct. Quite astounding results sometimes that if I'd have believed them, I would have made big mistakes. So anyway, that's not to say it's not working, but I do think that there's going to be still quite a long trajectory in being able to adapt and utilize artificial intelligence in the way that we're talking about, and a point that it really helps farmers. But it's probably going to help, but it's not going to be quick, I don't think. But anybody else have any comment?
Maybe more in the development than in the disbursement?
Yeah. Yes, yes, I'd agree with that. And any other Ron, please.
Just wanted to make a comment on that. I do think we need to understand that artificial intelligence, it is about creating logic, and from logic creating outputs, which is different, which can help us to create logic, that usually helps, and it can support, but it doesn't replace decision-making and the decision-taking in a complex system. And I think we need to strongly invest in understanding complex systems, which doesn't mean that you don't have to invest in seeds, simple solution, productivity, drought-resistant seed, resilience, etc., but put it in that more complex systems decision space. On the communication, I think it's actually a very, very good point. And you make a comment about humanitarian versus, and I think we have an opportunity also get closer to humanitarian interventions. That those humanitarian interventions that are trying to get out of their way when they're doing that, because they don't want us scientists close to that. You need to let them do their job. But prior to, in preparedness to a response, and in the quality of the response and the decision-making in that response, we can do a lot. And let me give a simplified response, but the capability of working with some of those last delivery partners, they can hand out seed. It makes a huge difference if they hand out drought-resistant seed of maize or just seed of maize. And if we ask the question, usually the answer is, well, we're just handing out seed. I mean, what do you mean? Drought resistance versus none, or, okay, so can we also create that space? And I think that is gonna open up an opportunity for also discussing then broader investments and the value for that community of what we do. And I think ADI, one of the projects that we're doing in Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, we're seeing that it's not always an easy conversation, but it is a very powerful conversation when it works to connect those last mile delivery components. Can we also use, there must be a wealth of data sitting in those interventions that we could probably leverage too, then with our data systems, make better decisions towards our development innovation pipeline. As for communication, it's always difficult to market or to get what you avoided. Yeah, something avoided is way more difficult to communicate than a crisis that you can, etc. However, there are folks that are very good at marketing that avoidance too, which is exactly the national security space. But we're probably not yet talking their language. We did a first step by showing there's a link between food security and national security, but this is not national security language. This is great language for me to understand and to be able to frame my work in that, but I think we really need to look at who are those in that space that really can translate it into national security language, that is language of probabilities and avoidance, and the value of avoidance is way higher there, probably valued than in general, and they have smart ways to represent that. So I think there's something to think about. Can we leverage that?
We've talked a lot about research and the need for research and increasing the investment there, and especially associated with productivity. I'm interested to hear a little more about research as it pertains to nutrition. We know that, I'm sure you've all seen malnutrition, as have I, in developing nations. And I'm interested to hear a little more about how, Kip has talked about his dad and how the next generation will move the needle. Dr. Brahm, you've talked about the investment in 7 to 14 years and what does that look like. So I'm interested to hear the vision of what research do we need? Is it only productivity? Are you envisioning that taking nutrition into account? Also with agri-food systems, right now agriculture is a large, at least in the U.S., a lot of it is a large-scale farm. The average age of the farmer in the U.S. is growing, and there's about to be a huge generational shift. And then you also look at conflict areas where earlier we were having conversations about demining in Ukraine, and how do we use that soil after they've had explosions on it. If you look at Gaza, there's no agricultural land in Gaza. So do we talk about hydroponics? how do we rebuild in these crisis areas, and how do we use these research other than productivity? And I'm just curious to the 4 panelists who have seen what malnutrition really looks like. How do you view agriculture and our agri-food system in 10, 20, 30 years?
I'll welcome any other comments, but I will comment if we go to Tucker. You have a comment to make about how do you view development agriculture in the communities that you're contacting now? How do you think that will look in 10 years in terms of food quality, nutrition, and productivity?
Yeah, for example, in Guatemala, 50% of the children are malnourished. And so it's a massive issue now and into the future, stunted development and whatnot coming from that. One thing I want to highlight is the need for sharing that knowledge of current technologies that are out there so that make sure it gets out to all the different countries and all the different farmers in the world. That's really critical because there's so many advancements that really haven't fully distributed out to the world. And then another is climate smart intensification. And so making sure with the land we have in production, we really use that to maximize potential and in a sustainable way, because it's an issue for many smallholder farmers. The economics don't make sense of what their farm size is and what available options are for them. So the more we can intensify that production in a sustainable way, that's going to help them both in a food security sense, but then also being able to carve some land out for livelihoods and high-value crops so that they could, save some money and, build some buffer and some resiliency.
Any other comments? Bram, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe quickly. I think there were multiple thoughts in what. No, that's great. Actually, I'm trying to still get my head. No, it's fantastic. So on a few just quick responses. I do think the force of agriculture in rebuilding. We need to start thinking about that, and how do you rebuild? There's an opportunity almost to rebuild that agriculture sector in some of those conflict areas when they come out of that in a better way. But it will require strategic planning. It will require, so we should start thinking already about that. Nutrition and resilience for me go hand in hand. If you look at nutrition and resilience, that does mean you need diversified crops. You cannot have a healthy diet based on maize. Or based on maize and wheat alone. I mean, even if you come from from Summit, the maize and wheat center, you need other crops. And then the question is, can we actually open up some of these investments that have been used in corn and maize and wheat to actually do what we did with the productivity gains, with the disease resistance? Can we open up those platforms, data systems, breeding pipelines for some of those opportunity crops, and then really go through which of those can we almost supercharge by or leapfrog by putting some of that on the existing infrastructure that we have and the knowledge infrastructure that we have around that. And didn't want to, last comment, there's a few comments on Central America. I really do think we need to look at Central America, and the failure of the agri-food systems is part of what makes people decide to move, because when food and access to food becomes too complex, we take those kind of decisions. But at the same time, I think there's an opportunity. If we can develop those livelihood trajectories in Central America, and several of us are working there, so I think the grassroots organizations that are there can be easily activated and work together towards activating that agricultural sector. But also southern Mexico, for example, can we develop a plan to develop the agricultural sector in southern Mexico for export, for regional areas that can capture some of that, for some of those first waves of migration out of Central America, to actually give them decent jobs and develop the agriculture sector. And that does not have to compete with the US. I think there's enough to serve globally to actually make that work together and make that a hub towards those products then becoming actually maybe input towards a more sophisticated transformation industry in the US, for example, that then goes out, et cetera, but that's another conversation. Thanks.
You know, World World War II got us to a place where the United States, it was just after the Depression, just after we had a lot of food insecurity in the United States, we developed the interstate highway system. We also were feeding 9 million troops around the world, so we had to figure out how to process food. From that time on, we were never food insecure, but we moved more towards highly processed foods. And I look at families today, both parents a lot of times work out of the house. Kids come home, they eat a highly processed food diet of some sort. They lack activity outside, playing like most of us did as kids growing up. And so now we have childhood diabetes is growing at an astronomical rate in the United States. Obesity is actually a bigger issue in the United States and a lot of developing countries or developed countries around the world. So we do need to really focus on nutrition, and we need to focus on nutrition in the developing world as well. But we need to realize not one size fits all. We got into this food system discussion in Rome oftentimes, and it was like one food system had to exist. It couldn't be anything else that could be accepted. And it was one that wasn't going to allow us to be able to feed people the way we need to feed them. You know, high-priced food, I mean, I want to go to more vegetables, more fruits and everything else, but it takes cold supply chains. It takes the ability to store and produce year-round. It takes a lot of things a lot of the developing world doesn't have. So we need to make sure as we make these decisions, as we look at food systems, that we don't increase the cost of food, taking it out of the reach of those who can least afford it the most. We really need to focus on a large variety of different solutions for the entire world.
Okay, we have time. We don't really have time. We're going to take the time for 1 minute comment and another 1 minute comment, okay? And this gentleman, Andrew's been waiting for a long
Sure.
time.
Thanks very much. Andrew Mack from AgroMobile. We're a data platform that connects small farmers with large supply chains around the world and input suppliers with the farmers. And I'm curious, we've talked a lot about the idea of solving the problem as a supply problem, but we've got 30% of the 30% of the goods that are pulled out of the ground in most countries that never make it to market. So for me, this sounds at least as much like a market access problem as anything. We forget that in addition to all other things, farming is the biggest employer in the world, right? And the largest number of employer for people who have no other real options. And so I'd be curious to hear what people have to say about the future of market access and the future of farming as a job, because we have to have that as a job option. Thanks.
Thanks for your comments. We won't answer that one right now. We'll have Dr. Mishra, you want to have a final comment?
Regarding the communication, I want to just build on that. I think when you think about communication, we often forget the social and cultural aspect of communication. In many countries, women actually make the decision about food. And I want to tell you a very quick example of what happened in Zambia. In Zambia, a lot of children go blind. About 40% of the children go blind because they don't have vitamin A in their food. Yellow maize has vitamin A, just like yellow carrot. Did you know that in the US, most of the carrot was white at one time? Not very many people know that. But doesn't matter. Yellow maize, in Zambia, they would not eat yellow because the color indicates weakness. White is the color of strength. So they would not eat it. You know who changed this whole situation? The women, the mothers. The mother said that my kid is not going to go blind. You know, they mashed those, grains. And while they were mashing, they sang songs. My kid is not going to go blind. My kid is not going to go blind in African. And they started dancing. They were wearing regalia, beautiful clothes. We have captured that in a video, in a movie. And then they started doing small business. How to create diets using this yellow maize.